On a 95-degree summer afternoon, a correctly sized evaporative cooler drops indoor air from 95 degrees down to 72 degrees, using only water and a fan. No refrigerant, no compressor, no monthly contract. That 23-degree drop costs 75% less electricity than the machine sitting on the roof of the house next door. The smell is wet desert air, clean and faintly mineral. The sound is almost nothing, just moving air, the way wind moves through a canyon before a storm. Here is the number that changes everything. The system that produces that result costs between $150 and $400. The physics behind it is older than written mathematics. It cooled the homes of kings and farmers across 3 continents before a single engineer in a suit had ever drawn a schematic. And the most remarkable part is not the technology. It is the fact that you have never heard of it. To understand how this disappeared from American construction, you have to go back to ancient Persia and a clay jar. Around 2500 BCE, someone in the Nile Delta hung a porous clay vessel in a doorway and noticed the air passing through it felt cooler than the air outside. The vessel was sweating, water seeped through the clay wall, reached the outer surface and evaporated, and in evaporating, it pulled thermal energy from the surrounding air. This is the latent heat of vaporization. Roughly 970 BTUs were consumed per pound of water that transitions from liquid to vapor. Heat removed from the air and carried away invisibly on a breeze. Egyptian tomb frescoes document servants fanning large clay urns to accelerate this effect in the chambers of the wealthy. Persian domestic architecture was designed around it. Entire sleeping quarters, granaries, food storage rooms, all built to exploit this one physical law. This knowledge existed 4,500 years before Willis Carrier filed a single patent. A clay jar in a breeze solved the same problem that $4,000 of compressor machinery pretends to solve today. The physics is not complicated. That simplicity is precisely what makes its disappearance impossible to explain on technical grounds alone. What makes this truly remarkable is that the principle did not stay in one place. It did not belong to one civilization, or one climate, or one century. Every culture that endured serious summer heat independently arrived at the same conclusion. In ancient India, woven grass screens called kustatis were soaked in water and hung in doorways and windows. Hot air passed through the wet fiber, evaporation pulled the heat out, and the air that reached the interior of the room was measurably cooler. In China, ceramic water vessels were positioned in courtyards to exploit the same effect. In North Africa, thick-walled earthen structures were designed with narrow openings that funneled prevailing winds across interior water features. Different continents, different materials, identical physics. The principle was not discovered once, it was discovered everywhere, by everyone independently, because the physics demanded it. That is not a coincidence. That is a law of nature so obvious that human beings on opposite sides of the planet reached the same answer without ever speaking to each other. And then, in the span of a single American generation, it vanished. The most sophisticated version of this principle appeared in Persian wind towers called badjir. Structures were built across the Iranian plateau from at least 1000 BCE, and some are still standing today in the city of Yazd. A badjir is a tall masonry tower with directional vanes at its top, designed to catch prevailing winds and funnel them downward into a water reservoir at the base of the building. Air crosses the water surface, evaporation cools it, and the denser, cooled air descends through channels into the living quarters below. No electricity, no machinery, no service call. Persian architectural surveys confirm interior temperatures in badger-cooled rooms ran 20 to 30 degrees below exterior air temperature during peak summer heat. Travelers who visited Yazd during the medieval period documented stepping through a doorway and feeling the air change, not slightly but dramatically. The system needed no contractor. It needed geometry and water. It worked for 3,000 years until someone needed you to pay a monthly bill. The physics underneath the badger is worth understanding completely because it is the same physics underneath every evaporative cooler ever built. When air moves across a wet surface, water molecules at the surface absorb energy energy from the surrounding air and escape into vapor. That energy transfer is not small. It is enormous relative to the mass of water involved. The air that surrenders that energy becomes cooler and denser air sinks. In a Badger, that sinking motion is the engine. The tower catches wind at the top, forces it down across the water reservoir. Evaporation strips the heat, and the cooled air falls naturally into the rooms below. No pump, no fan, no electricity. Gravity and thermodynamics do the work that a 3-ton compressor does today, at a fraction of the energy cost, with no moving parts, no refrigerant lines, and no service contract. The Badger did not approximate comfort. Persian architectural records and traveler accounts consistently describe interior spaces that felt dramatically different from the desert air outside. Not slightly cooler, dramatically cooler. The system worked because the physics works. It has always worked. It will always work. By the 1920s, American engineers in Arizona and New Mexico had rediscovered the principle through necessity. They built galvanized steel housings, aspen fiber pads, belt-driven blowers, and float valve water reservoirs. Simple assemblies pulled desert air through wet fiber and delivered cooled air into living spaces. Patent filings from this era document commercial swamp coolers as early as the 1930s. Sears catalog listings from the 1940s show them priced within reach of working families. By 1950, the majority of residential buildings in Phoenix and Tucson used some form of evaporative cooling. Families slept through desert summers without a utility bill that threatened the household budget. The pads stayed wet. The air moved through. For 30 years, that arrangement held. Then the training manuals arrived. The Carrier Corporation had been commercializing refrigerant-based air conditioning since the 1910s. By the post-war era, it was expanding aggressively into the residential market. ASHRAE was formalizing standards. A new professional infrastructure was being built, licensed, HVAC contractors, refrigerant handling certifications, manufacturer relationships, service contracts, all organized around the compressor. The evaporative cooler sat outside this infrastructure entirely. It required no refrigerant, no licensed technician, no annual service agreement. A homeowner with a garden hose in 30 minutes could replace the pad. That is the part they could not tolerate, not the technology, the independence. The training manual had 40 pages on refrigerant cycles, 0 pages on wet bulb depression. Building codes were written by committees where HVAC manufacturers held seats. Energy compliance pathways recognized refrigerant systems and left no checkbox for passive evaporative cooling. They did not ban it. They just made sure no one learned it existed. Then the code arrived. Through the 1960s and the 1970s, as model building standards consolidated across American jurisdictions, evaporative cooling was excluded from the classifications governing new construction. In several southwestern states, new residential builds required refrigerant systems to satisfy cooling provisions. In climates where humidity data made evaporative cooling physically superior for the majority of summer hours, an analysis by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory confirmed that evaporative systems met or exceeded thermal comfort requirements across ASHRAE climate zones 2B, 3B, and 4B. These are the exact zones where swamp coolers had been working since the 1930s. The code did not say the system did not work. The code said it did not count. Here is twist number 2, and it is more disturbing than any conspiracy because it requires no villain. When the Environmental Protection Agency began regulating refrigerants under the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990s, R22 was phased out and R410A was mandated as the replacement. Homeowners across the country replaced existing systems at $3,000 to $6,000 per installation. The evaporative cooler was unaffected, no regulated refrigerant, and no Environmental Protection Agency certification was required. A seasonal pad replacement cost between $20 and $40. 2 hours of a homeowner's time. A system you can maintain yourself is a system no one can profit from maintaining for you. The Energy Star program offered no certification pathway for evaporative coolers in its early decades. This was not because the technology failed efficiency tests. It was because the administrative framework was not built around it. No one voted to erase evaporative cooling from American construction. construction. The incentive structure did the work silently, over decades, through the accumulated weight of standards and training pipelines that pointed every new building toward the compressor and away from the pad. Then came the fear. Through the 1990s and the 2000s, HVAC trade publications began associating evaporative cooling with mold risk and Legionella contamination. The inspector repeated it. The insurance underwriter repeated it. The contractor repeated it in every sales call. But here is what physics cannot erase. The Legionella risk they cited was documented in large commercial cooling towers, complex recirculating systems with warm stagnant reservoirs, entirely different in design from a residential evaporative cooler. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention guidance on Legionella explicitly distinguishes between commercial cooling towers and residential units. A residential pad replaced seasonally maintains no standing warm water capable of sustaining Legionella colonization. They used the fear of one machine to bury the reputation of a different one, and it worked, not because the claim was accurate, but because no institution with sufficient authority had any financial incentive to correct it. The fear did not need to be true. It only needed to be repeated by enough people in enough official sounding contexts until it became the default assumption. That is how you erase a technology without disproving it. You do not run a test, you repeat a story. But the engineers came back. Through the 2000s and the 2010s, researchers at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, along with teams at the Rocky Mountain Institute, documented the performance of two-stage indirect-direct evaporative cooling systems. A first stage cools incoming air without adding humidity. A second stage applies direct evaporative cooling to air already preconditioned. The result is outlet temperatures below the wet bulb threshold, a feat refrigerant air conditioning cannot accomplish in dry climates. NREL technical reports confirmed performance coefficients substantially higher than conventional refrigerant systems under identical dry climate conditions. The reports were published, the data was public, the adoption rate barely moved. The market had reorganized itself entirely around the compressor. The engineers proved it worked better than before. The building code had already moved on, and this is the part they cannot explain away. The proof sits in public databases across the European Union, in Spain, Portugal, southern France, and Italy, Mediterranean climates whose summer humidity profiles are functionally identical to the American Southwest. Evaporative cooling has been integrated into passive building standards and monitored for more than a decade. The European Union Energy Performance of Buildings Directive created a framework for auditing actual building energy use. Within that framework, evaporative pre-cooling systems and certified installations across multiple European sites produce documented energy reductions in cooling load that align precisely with what NREL measured on the other side of the Atlantic. Research institutions studying Mediterranean building performance published results in peer-reviewed building energy journals. The monitoring was rigorous. The methodology was auditable. The conclusions were unambiguous. The data existed. The database was public. No one in Washington opened the file. And that is not an oversight. An oversight gets corrected when someone points it out. This did not get corrected. It stayed buried because the people with the authority to correct it had no financial reason to do so, and every financial reason not to. Here is the real reason this disappeared. Not because it stopped working. Because the system of approval had no room for something that worked without a manufacturer's warranty, a licensed installer, a certified refrigerant, and a service agreement. The inspector had no checkbox for it. The insurance underwriter needed a brand name on the unit before signing the policy. The contractor had never seen it in a training manual. Today, a whole house evaporative unit installs for $700 to $1,500, including labor. Some utility programs in dry climate states offer rebates for evaporative systems, recognizing that a cooler using a fraction of the electricity of a compressor system reduces grid load during peak summer hours. The pad costs $40. The physics costs nothing. And here's what that actually means in a lifetime of home ownership. The average American household in a dry climate state spends between $400 and $700 every single summer running a refrigerant air conditioning system. Over 30 years, that is between $12,000 and $21,000 spent cooling a house. A whole house evaporative system installed today costs $1,500 at the high end. The pad replacement runs $40 a year. Over 30 years, the total cost of ownership is under $3,000. The difference between those two numbers, the gap between what the compressor costs and what the pad costs, is not a rounding error. It is a decision someone made for you, embedded in building codes and training manuals and certification frameworks long before you ever signed a mortgage. Water still evaporates. The wet bulb temperature of the air outside your home right now sits below the dry bulb temperature by a margin that, in a dry climate, is large enough to cool a house. The latent heat of vaporization is still 970 British thermal units per pound. The cellulose pad, saturated and faced into a moving airstream, still delivers cooler air on the other side. Persian kings slept under air, cooled by this principle. Arizona homesteaders ran it off a garden hose and a motor the size of a coffee can. European buildings monitored by engineering institutions are doing it right now. Their performance logged in databases any regulator could access before lunch. The physics has not changed. The air has not changed. The pad is still wet. The air is still moving. The temperature is still dropping. No invoice is arriving.